So smartphone upgrades have been really incremental over the past few years, especially in the cameras. The last time the Samsung S20 was upgraded was in the S22, so that was last year's model. So now we have the Samsung S23. What are the camera upgrades? Well, this video is going to answer all the details. We're going to go into photos, stills, video, we're going to test portrait mode, selfie cameras, all four cameras and stuff like that. So I'm really excited to share you my in-depth comparison. So here I want to demonstrate the generational upgrades from the S20 all the way to the 21, 22, and 23. Now between the S20 and the S21, there had been no upgrades in the ultra-wide, the wide or telephoto or selfie. There could have been image signal processing upgrades from the SoC, the Snapdragon 888, but it's hard to confirm that. So these are all the same. It is when we switched to the S22, we got an upgrade apparently to the wide, to the telephoto, and not the selfie. So we got an upgrade in terms of the wide. We got a 12.8%, so 12.8% sensor size increase, which is nice. But we also did slightly get a wider lens. So I think it went from 23 millimeters to like from 26 to 23. So that means you're going to get a slightly wider field of view. So that's in the wide. In the telephoto, we went from a 1.1x zoom plus a 3x digital. And the digital zoom is never a good thing, right? So we basically got a 3x telephoto, which is a nice upgrade as well. And the telephoto for the S20 and the S21 used to be 50 megapixels. And that was a weird choice because not many people were using the telephoto zoom lens, and you need 50 megapixels to capture 8K quality. So you had this weird thing where the telephoto had the 1.1x zoom, so it was a slightly tighter focal length, and therefore you had to use a sensor that was inferior to the wide, because usually it's the wide sensor that has the biggest sensor. So what they ended up doing was they swapped it. So basically, the 3x telephoto is just a regular 12 megapixel, and the wide sensor is now the 50 megapixel. Sorry, this is getting a little bit. So, and to the 23, nothing else has changed except for the selfie camera. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So nothing changed here, nothing changed here. Now the ultra wide, I could not find any research, any indicator that the hardware was upgraded, but I have substantially noticed that in the S22, the picture quality became a lot sharper from the S20. So I don't know if that has to deal with the image signal processor. Maybe it's doing a better job, but I think there might have been an upgrade in the ultra wide. So it's hard to confirm that. By the way, all the sensors except for the ultra wide and I believe the selfie have optical image stabilization on top of digital image stabilization. So both these have the typical OIS, so optical image stabilization. I hope that explains the upgrade path in terms of hardware. From S20 to S21, we got nothing. Then here we got the hardware leap, and then everything stayed the same from the S22 to 23, except we got the selfie. And now we did get one hardware upgrade in the camera array, and that's in the selfie camera. And this is a very important update because we haven't had an update in the selfie camera from the 10 megapixel to the 12 megapixel, I think all the way from the S10. So it's been using really old technology, and selfie cameras have become very, very important. For example, maybe you want to film yourself. It's being able to frame yourself is the key aspect of it, and having to use the rear sensor because it's, the rear sensor is typically the best sensor, the best optics and the largest sensor size. But being able to just frame yourself and still have really good quality is really helpful for those people who are addicted to social media, vanity, TikTok, or more in a more serious note, like video conferencing and stuff like that. So selfie cameras are very important, especially since we can use them as webcams and stuff like that. So I'm very happy to see that upgrade. And spoiler alert, I'm very impressed with the selfie camera. I can't wait to show you the results. Now, unfortunately, with the Samsung S23, we didn't get any upgrade to the hardware. However, we obviously have a new chip. We have the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. And the previous model obviously had the Gen 1, the S22. So has the ISP, the image signal processor, the CPU, all that stuff, has it improved the digital quality? Because let's face it, the hardware on these cameras are very limited by optics and physics. It's really the software and the hardware optimizations that go along with that really make the improvement. So I'm going to compare this camera, the S23, with the previous generation, the S22. We'll do that comparison as well. And in case you missed it, I did a full in-depth review comparing the S20 versus the S23. I basically wanted to answer, was 3 generations worth the upgrade? And spoiler, it was a really good update, but I do recommend checking it out because I go into a lot of detail. But here in this video, we're going to focus on the cameras because that's one of the main reasons why people are buying smartphones these days, is to document their lives, film B-roll, C-roll, and stuff like that. So let's get into the image and video comparison. So for this section, let's do a side-by-side comparison in terms of still images. So right now you can see on the left side is the S20, which is the older camera, and on the right side, it's going to be the S23. And you can see the amount of detail that if you look at if you zoom up on the eye, how much more detail is retained in the actual S23 image. I'm very pleased with that. I think there's definitely an upgrade in this regard. Yeah, so you see right there, it's just a lot more detail. Now, one of the more noticeable upgrades that you don't really need to pixel peep to see in still photos is the ultra wide lens. And as I mentioned earlier, I couldn't find any evidence of an actual hardware upgrade in the ultra wide, but it must have been upgraded somewhere along the 21 or the 22 series. But I can really see the difference here. So I'm gonna go zoom in. So right there, you can see it's just a lot more detail on the right side, and that's obviously the S23. And it looks a lot better. Like, it's just so much more detailed. You can really see it. The landscape scenery just really pops out, and I really like that. And then here's a close-up of the floor. Just a lot more detail on the floor here. And then we go into corners here. You can see just a lot more detail again on the corners. It's less noise, less artifacting, and it's sharper. Another big improvement I noticed with the lens is the chromatic aberration. So you can see all this purple fringing on the left side. There's all the green fringing and all that stuff. It looks really bad. And on the right side, you can see the S23 really corrects for that, so you don't really see those artifacts. Okay, so here's another classic example where the S23 is just doing so much sharper. Like, look at the detail. Like, oh my goodness, on the bed, on the dog's fur, there's so much more detail on the S23. It's very hard it's a night and day difference, honestly. Yeah, we zoom in there. Wow, you can actually see stuff. It's just amazing. And I made sure that I use the same lens, same settings, everything as best as I can. Okay, so now we're really pixel peeping. We're zooming in like so much into my eyes. And I don't know, I kind of like the left side. I'm kind of confused. Oh, yeah, so this is like a blind test. The S23 was on the left side at this point. I kind of swapped them at this point. So I'm going to fix that, I think, in a second. But yeah, this is the front selfie camera. I did comment on this in my main review, how it just kind of has a warmer tone. Here I look kind of yellow. And then on the S23, it's a little bit cooler tone. But I don't like the color science on both. But I think this was a fluke. I think maybe just the lighting in the room just made it seem more kind of yellowy or something like that. So this is just an S23 photo. You can see on the right side, the cat is yawning and it's kind of blurry. And that's because in a low light situation, it always tries to optimize for picture quality. And so what happens is that it slows the shutter speed, so to let in more light, so it doesn't have to do other things like increase the ISO, which increases noise and whatnot. So if you can go into the camera assistant app, as I mentioned before, and you can actually prioritize speed, and then this situation will likely not happen. All right, here's another example. Just so much more detail on the right side with the S23. I really like it. Just doesn't look washed out. The S20 looks really washed out. So I love the detail. It's just fantastic. Here's one thing I don't like about the S23. This is both the S23 photos side by side. On the left side, I've smeared the telephoto lens, I think one of the lenses, and that's something that I don't like about the design, is because the 3 camera array on the rear side is so long. It's very easy to smudge it with your finger, at least with the telephoto 3x zoom lens. So that's just one thing I kind of wish they would address more in design, like maybe make the camera array smaller or shift it more like the iPhone. I talk about that in the main review, but you just need to be careful about that. Every time you take a photo, you basically have to check the back of the lens and make sure there's no fingerprints, smudge, oil, grease on it. Another thing that the S23 really improves upon is in the blur effect, so the portrait mode in stills. In terms of the video, it's still an improvement, but it still has edge detection issues. But what I really like about the improvement with the S23, if you look on the right side, is that it can recognize just like non-faces. It can recognize any inanimate object, and it can do the background blur. So that's really cool for social media. If you want to fake that you have a DSLR, like a very expensive lens, you can have that background. And you can see that the edge detection is actually really good in this scene. Here's another portrait image where the image is blurred on the background. You can just see there's so much more detail on the S23. So before we begin the comparison, I just want to let you know that you're going to be seeing video footage that's being recorded through OBS because I need to give my commentary as I go through the different pictures and videos and stuff like that. If you want to see the raw, unedited footage, I'm going to upload the comparison without my commentary, and you can click the link and you can just watch it for yourself without any bias or anything like that. So there'll be less degradation in quality. Obviously, the YouTube will still compress it a bit, but there won't be any kind of layer on top of it. So check out the link in the description if you just want to watch the comparison without my voice at all. And then from there, you can actually hear the audio differences between the two cameras. Let's go into my commentary about between the two cameras. So right now, I'm going to show you the wide main lens. And we're going to be, notice the audio when it switches from between the two.
So right now I'm filming at 4K 30 frames and I've turned off video stabilization since both these smartphone cameras are mounted on a tripod. Now, how is the microphone? I'm going to be speaking in an untreated room and it's relatively small, so there's probably...
So here you can see on the S20, the color science, I just don't like it. Everything kind of looks more purplish or reddish hue, whereas on the S23 it looks a lot more natural. However, there's one thing that I'm not happy about is that the S23 has a darker image. So the exposure, it seems to expose less. And I've noticed this in a bright situation, which we'll show later. It sometimes works in its advantage when it's too bright in the scene and the exposure makes sense, but it tends to underexpose in this kind of indoor low light environment. And another downside with the S23 is that it seems to have less detail. The S20 seems to have more detail despite the colors looking worse. So I like the color science, I like on the S23, but the detail and the exposure looks better on the S20, which is really shocking. Now, it may be affected by the actual codec I'm using. It could be that in this scene, the S23 is using the HEVC codec, and it wasn't prioritized to use high quality mode. I can show you what that means. Let me quickly show you. So you can see that high efficiency videos prioritize video quality. Now, I'm pretty sure I enabled HEVC with prioritized video quality, so I'm not sure what's happening here, but there's an extra option that I think recently came out where you can increase the bitrate. So you can see there's high bitrate mode. And when I was filming this test, when I first got the S23, I don't think this was available, so this must have came after a software update. But when you switch to Pro mode, you get the higher bitrate. So we're going to compare the Pro mode later, and you can see the quality is a little bit better, and it kind of matches more of the S20. So this may have been a flawed test in the beginning.
That's going to be a stress test. I'm also coming with the highest quality sensor, which is the middle, about 24
So you can see I kind of look more blurry on the S23 when I'm zooming in. This is a digital crop. This is like pixel peeping at this point, but you can see that the S20 retains more detail. Okay, now we switch to the telephoto, and again, the exposure is darker on the S23. This is not a digital zoom, this is an optical zoom. The telephoto doesn't have a strong of a sensor, so it's going to be a little bit less quality than the rear main, but it still looks really good. Let me go back to that. So I do find that the quality is better on the S23. I think there's more detail. You can see that the S20 has a slight zoom, and that's because it's actually a 1.1 optical zoom on the telephoto with a 3x digital zoom. So it's slightly more zoomed in. It's a little bit confusing, but that's a minor detail. But yeah, I kind of, again, the color science still looks better on the S23. I just don't like that fake look, and it just looks oversaturated on the S20. Okay, now we're switching to the ultra wide, and let me go full screen here, and I zoom in.
30 frames per second.
Here, okay, so the ultra wide, again, same color science. And yeah, I think the S23 is doing slightly better, but it could be the codec, the bitrate encoding. So we're going to switch to a different scene. Again, it's underexposed, so, or it's not as exposed as the S20. But here you can see the grain of the S20 because it's probably jacking up the ISO to get that higher exposure. You can see how grainy it is, whereas on the other side, it doesn't look as grainy. So pretty cool and so far there. And one thing, I know I'm switching between the audio. Audio is like, I guess the S23 is slightly better. When you go into, if you listen with headphones and you watch the raw footage of this, when you do the telephoto, it does the space zoom or the audio zoom, which is kind of a cool feature, I suppose. All right, let's switch to the selfie camera.
Now I'm speaking into the
So yeah, immediately the S20 has some weird artifact. It's like so much noise and stuff like that. And again, the S23 is underexposed, but it looks way better. Like, I really like the selfie camera. You're going to see more samples later on. But again, I don't know if it's the codec or not, but they both look good. I'm sorry. In terms of the detail, they both have a lot of detail, but the S23, just the colors look natural. Okay, here I try to bump the exposure. And
camera. It has more megapixels.
yeah, it's still, I
10
mean,
to 12 megapixels.
now the colors are kind of blotching, so I don't know. Bumping the exposure in post-production isn't going to make it look, it might have issues. It's better to get it right in the camera the first time. So,
1, 2, 3. The quick bound.
all right, let's move on. I talk. Then I like a demo mode. Here, I just don't like how dark it is. Yeah, it just kind of annoys me. Okay, portrait mode is pretty interesting.
S23.
Okay, so the S20 just looks awful in portrait mode. It's just the digital sharpening and yeah. So the in portrait mode when you're filming with the rear camera, it looks pretty good on the S23. Obviously, edge detection around the edges is not going to be great. You'd rather have a expensive camera for that, a DSLR or mirrorless camera.
ISP, the image signal processor.
Yeah, the colors again. The color science on the S23 is a major improvement. I really like it.
And this should help
Okay, and then we go back to the wide main.
crazy HDR.
I think I go in pro video mode at this point, so I think it's more of an Okay, so yeah, this is kind of like the first test where I was concerned about the codec, and I think in this mode here we're in pro video mode, so I think the bitrate is a bit higher on the S23, so it looks way better. Like, okay, not way better, but the S20 looks more washed out. It's darker exposure. I think the S23 is finally exposing correctly, and it's just way sharper. And yeah, the pro video mode I think is recommended if you want to use it. Okay, here I do the digital zoom. Yeah, there's more detail on the S23, so I like that. So let's move on to the next example. We go back to the ultra wide. I think that's a good example to look at. So the S20 just looks very washed out. The S23 retains more details. Now this is all video. We're gonna go into the still mode, the photos and stuff, and you get to see more of a difference there. But like, yeah, just I zoom in on the ultra wide here digitally, and the S20 looks awful. It just looks terrible. So I really like the improvements on the ultra wide in the S23, and I think that was part of the S22. Okay, so we switched to a different scene, and this is where I talk about the exposure. Generally speaking, it seems like the S23 is exposing, underexposing or exposing less, whereas the S20 seems to be overexposing. So you can see that it's brighter on the left side, and yeah. So in this scene, the S23 is actually doing a better job. And yeah, I like the colors. Both look over exposed though, to be honest. I was filming this in my so-called studio with like a lot of lighting, so maybe it's not handling it very well. I do recommend to not use auto mode if you're in a studio. Just switch to pro mode, and you can control the shutter and the ISO and all that stuff, and it's gonna look a lot nicer. I was pretty stunned by the results. Yeah, we zoom in here. Yeah, the detail looks nicer on the S23. So, and let me know what you think of the audio. It's would be interesting. Okay, so we go to the telephoto here, and it just looks a lot nicer. I really like the telephoto 3x, the 3x optical zoom on the S23. I think it looks nicer.
Obviously, I'm going to be really far away, so maybe the microphone.
Yeah, overexposing on the S20 as predicted in the auto mode. So they definitely tweak the software, the algorithm. We go to ultra wide.
Obviously, the S23 is going to be sharper.
More contrast on the S23.
Okay, so now we're.
Now we switch to wide portrait mode.
Portrait video.
Again, the colors just look awful, oversaturated, kind of weird colors, unnatural colors on the S20, S23, the new phone. Even though the edge, look at my ears, right? It just doesn't look great, but the colors are way better. The details there, it's retained. Yeah, I kind of like it, so it's not bad. Okay, now HDR10 Plus, I just wanted to try it. It's gonna look awful because Adobe Premiere, I didn't set the tone mapping. There's just like some configuration where you can like just map the HDR. HDR just requires a different type of display, so it's kind of a silly test. So don't mind that. On the phone, it's gonna look normal. It's gonna help you with increasing the darkness in the bright spots and the inverted of that. So that's not something I really care about. Okay, here let's look at so much more detail on the S23. The colors look way better. Like again, the cat looks weird in terms of the colors. Okay, we switch to the ultra wide, a little bit darker. It's underexposing on the S23. Okay, we go into the telephoto. Yeah, there's just more noise on the S20. There's a lot less noise on the S23. So that sensor is doing a better job. The optical zoom is doing a better job. We go back to the main wide angle. Cat yawns, and just they look kind of similar. Yeah, it's hard to see it there. But here, like look at the detail. Look at the cat on the left side, on the right side, S23, and then look at the colors on the S20. Like that's not how the cat should look like. when I see it in real life, it looks like the S23 on the right side. That's the colors I want to see. And he yawns too. Very cute cats. Oh yeah, and just oh my god, like you're gonna see this in the images, but like if you just look at the bed sheet here, like I don't know what's going on with the S20. It's just like it's so soft, no detail. I don't know if it's just yeah, I don't know. All right, so let's switch to stills mode. This is very interesting. Here we're gonna compare the softness. Okay, so we're comparing against the S23 on its own, and so yeah, the S23 has this option in the camera assistant app, and I talk about this in the full in-depth review. You can download the camera assistant app from the Galaxy store, and then you have more options to swap between. You can control the picture quality, and I like that. It's a very confusing experience because you have to download another app from the Galaxy store, so it's a little bit cumbersome in that regard. I kind of just wish it was all built into the native app. Anyways, I'll talk about that in my main review, but here you can see the softening is turned off. On the left side, this is both the S23, and I think it looks nicer. I really don't like this super. You can see the texture patterns on the towel and on the bed. It just looks really fake. Like it does look sharper, but if you just look at that on its own, like if you don't look at the sharp image and you just look at the with no softening enabled. Sorry, if you look at the left side, by itself, I think it just looks normal. So here we just show you what it looks like. If you don't want to lose all the detail, maybe you want to retain some sharpness, I recommend maybe keeping it at medium. So the middle frame is the medium frame. It doesn't look as bad as the super sharpened image. When you switch to the 50 megapixel sensor, it's not pixel binning anymore, so it doesn't do very well in low light situations. But when you switch to 50 megapixel mode, the colors, like the sharpening, there's no over sharpening. The colors look normal and it looks really nice in a bright environment. So I do recommend to use that mode if you're in a bright setting because it looks the most natural, like a regular camera. You just need a lot of light. The last thing I want to mention is the comparison between the S22 and the S23. But this one was really hard to detect because the only real difference is the image signal processor. Obviously, the S22 is using the same camera array aside from the selfie lens, but so it's using the same rear camera array, and I can tell that it was hard. You have to pause, but the S23 has less noise, so perhaps the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, its ISP, the image signal processor, is doing a better job at capturing that information from the lens, same hardware, but processing it and reducing the noise because you can see that there's a pretty noticeable difference in that regard. But if you look at this without pausing the video side by side, you're not really going to notice an upgrade. So if you have the S22, please don't upgrade to S23 unless you want a more efficient CPU power efficiency. Yeah.
Oh, I'm doing super.
All right, here I switched to super steady. And what's interesting is that on the S23, you can get super steady at 1440p. So you get more resolution versus the 1080p. But I don't recommend it. So let's look at it right now.
Super steady.
So you see how terrible the S23 looks? That's because when you want to have a higher resolution, the camera can't do pixel binning. So it has to work harder, and therefore it just doesn't work better. The higher resolution in super steady doesn't work well in a low light environment. You want to switch it to the lower resolution. I know it sucks, but if this was like an outdoor, like super bright environment, I would suspect that the super steady 1440p on the S23 would look superior and sharper to the S22's 1080p limited. The S22 can't even do 1440p. So, but yeah, it looked terrible there, like just awful. Like look at the color. So the S22 wins in this situation because it was on the right setting. All right, now we go to the ultra wide. Let me just zoom in here. I'm trying to pause it. They look kind of similar. They have a little bit of a different look. Like the S22 has this more noise, and then the S23 is just more soft. So I think the image signal processing is perhaps a little bit better on the S23. You can go to telephoto here. They're quite similar. I think the S23 has better exposure. And yeah, they're both kind of busy. So I don't know if there's any I'm seeing less of an improvement. So that's a comparison between the S23 and its older brother, the S20. Overall, I'm very pleased with the upgrades. I really like that there is a lot more sharpness in the ultra wide, the telephoto, and the rear lens just looks a lot nicer. When you switch to 50 megapixels, make sure you're in the bright setting. Only use it then, but if you want to shoot in a more low light environment, I do recommend it to shoot at the 12 megapixel. In terms of video performance, I think they both are improvement over the S20, and especially in the selfie camera, it just looks way better. There's so much more detail in the S23 selfie camera that it almost rivals with one of the rear sensor, the main rear sensor. So I'm very pleased with the camera upgrades. Again, I really like that the ultra wide just looks so much more sharp. It's amazing. So I think it's a great upgrade. It took 3 years. The 21 didn't have really a big upgrade. The 22 finally had the hardware upgrade, and now we get slightly better image signal processing. Just be careful with the settings. For example, the super steady at 1440p, it can actually perform worse than some of the prior generations. So be careful with cranking up your resolution, like 8K resolution or the 50 megapixels in a low light environment. You want to keep it at a lower resolution if you're in a lower light environment, or decrease the frame rate. Anyways, that's it for this video. If you have any questions or comments about the comparison between the S20, S23, or the S22, let me know. Please watch the full review. I will leave a link in the description of the review of this S23 compared to the S20. And if you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.